The air in Landvehangelwijkroiden was always thick with the scent of damp earth and distant peat fires. I was 10 years old in 1853, though some days I felt 100, seeing the world through eyes that had watched too many storms roll in from the coast. Our village clung to the edge of the great, sprawling marshlands that stretched like a forgotten carpet towards the sea. Most folk called it the Black Mire, and they spoke of it in hushed tones, as if the very reeds could listen and carry their words to something unseen and unkind. My name is Thomas, and I was just a small lad then, but I remember everything. I remember the biting winds that would whip through our small stone cottage, rattling the panes, and I remember the peculiar quiet that fell when the mist, thick as sheep's wool, swallowed the land whole. That mist wasn't just cold, it carried a silence that pressed down on you, making your own heart thump like a drum. It was in that silence that the whispers grew loudest, tales of lost souls, of strange lights dancing in the bog, and of things that the marsh kept for itself, swallowed whole without a trace. Father always said the marsh was a fickle beast, offering good grazing in the drier months but quick to claim anything that strayed too far from the marked paths. He was a farmer, like most men in Landvehangel, scraping a living from the stubborn Welsh soil. Our lives were hard, marked by the rhythm of the seasons and the constant threat of hunger. We didn't have much, but we had each other, and the church on the hill, and the sturdy walls of our homes to keep the biting winds and the creeping dread of the mire at bay. The outside world felt a million miles away, a place of cities and carriages that we only heard about in hushed conversations when the occasional peddler or preacher passed through. Our world was the valley, the river, and the vast, brooding marsh. Older boys, bolder than me, would sometimes dare each other to venture a little further into the marsh, to find bird nests or chase after the wild ponies that sometimes grazed near its edges. But they never went deep, not truly. There was a respect, a fear even, etched into the faces of the adults when the subject of the Black Mire came up. They'd tell us stories, not just of people getting lost, but of unsettling things. My grandmother, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, would recall the tale of the silent folk who lived deep within the bog, moving without sound, watching with eyes like stagnant pools. She'd say they were the spirits of those the marsh had claimed, forever tethered to its gloomy embrace. I used to pull the blanket higher, imagining shadowy figures lurking just beyond our doorstep on moonless nights. The village itself was tiny, a cluster of stone houses around a humble chapel. Everyone knew everyone, and a stranger was a rare sight, usually bringing news or selling trinkets. Life was predictable, if harsh. The men worked the land, the women tended the homes and livestock, and children like me helped where we could, fetching water, gathering firewood, or chasing rebellious chickens. But beneath this surface of routine, there was a quiet tension. The marsh was always there, a silent, watchful presence, an untamed wilderness that bordered our carefully cultivated lives. It wasn't just a physical boundary, it was a psychological one. Few dared to cross it without good reason, and even then, they did so with a wary eye and a prayer on their lips. That summer, though, the marsh started to act differently. It wasn't the usual creeping fog or the sudden, treacherous sinkholes that marked its dangers. It was a stillness, a profound quiet that settled over it, even on breezy days. The birds, usually raucous with their calls, seemed muted, and the wild ponies kept further away, their eyes wide and skittish. Even the familiar hum of insects was gone. It was as if the marsh was holding its breath, waiting. My father, a man of few words but sharp instincts, noticed it too. He'd come back from the fields, his brow furrowed, sniffing the air like an old hound. "Something's amiss, lad," he'd grumble, shaking his head. "The mire's too quiet." We didn't know then that this eerie calm was the precursor to a storm, not of wind and rain, but of human folly and tragedy. We didn't know that the very land we feared was about to become a silent witness to events that would be deliberately erased from memory, a secret too terrible to ever be spoken aloud in the annals of history. The marsh, it turned out, was not just holding its breath, it was gathering its secrets, preparing to bury them deep within its peat-stained heart. And I, a small boy, was about to stumble into the chilling truth, a truth that would haunt my dreams for the rest of my days. The stage was set, not on a grand battlefield, but in the desolate, forgotten corner of Wales, where the mist clung to the ground like a shroud. The silent, waiting marsh would soon have its fill. My father's feeling that something was amiss didn't come from nowhere. It started with the disappearance of one of the younger farm hands, a lad named Bryn. He wasn't a village boy but had come from the hills to find work. Bryn was a good-natured fellow, always quick with a joke and a ready hand. One evening, he simply didn't return from checking the sheep. This wasn't an unheard of thing, a man could sprain an ankle, or a new bog could have formed and claimed him. The marsh was a silent killer, and we all knew it. But Bryn was a careful lad, and he knew the land well enough. Father sent me with a few others to help search, armed with lanterns and a grim sense of duty. We spent the night calling his name, our voices swallowed by the endless expanse of reeds and dark water. The air was cold, the mist was thicker than I'd ever seen it, and the ground was a treacherous, squelching mess. Every step was a risk. After hours of fruitless searching, the men's faces grew long. They spoke in hushed tones, talking not of an accident, but of a feeling. The feeling that Bryn hadn't just gotten lost. "He wasn't that daft," one of the older farmers muttered. "He knew the paths better than most." They concluded that the marsh had taken him, and with that final, grim pronouncement, the search was called off. Bryn's name was added to the long list of the lost, and his memory became another ghost to haunt the Black Mire. But a few days later, a second man vanished. This time it was an older farmer, a crofter named Elwyn, known for being a bit of a hermit but a kind soul. Elwyn had ventured out to tend to his few cows, and when his wife went to call him for dinner, he was nowhere to be found. His dog was still there, tied to a post, whining, but Elwyn was gone. His disappearance sent a shiver through the village that was far colder than any winter wind. 2 men in a week? This was not the usual rhythm of the marsh. This was something different, something unsettling. The men of the village, led by Father and the local preacher, decided to form a larger, more organized search party. This time, we would go deeper, where no one dared to tread before. I was not allowed to join the main party, of course. I was too young. But my heart hammered in my chest, a mixture of fear and an unshakable curiosity. I watched them go, a line of lanterns flickering and bobbing like fireflies against the encroaching gloom of the marsh. I spent the night by the fire with my mother, listening to the wind and imagining what horrors they might find. They returned at dawn, exhausted, mud-caked, and with a new fear etched onto their faces. They hadn't found Elwyn, but they had found something else. They had found his hat, lying neatly on a patch of dry ground, a place where a man would not have left it by accident. And scattered around it were some of his tools, arranged almost deliberately. It was a message, and the message was chillingly clear: Elwyn had not gotten lost. He had been taken. Panic began to ripple through the village like a stone dropped in a still pond. The old stories of the silent folk were resurrected, now told with a new sense of terrifying reality. But father, a man who saw the world in shades of mud and sweat, not ghosts, believed there was a more earthly explanation. "It's not spirits," he declared, his voice low and firm. "It's a person. A living, breathing person. The idea of a man, or men, lurking in the deepest part of the black mire, preying on our own, was even more terrifying than any ghost story. Who could survive out there? What kind of monster would live in such a god-forsaken place?" The village was a tinderbox of fear and speculation. A few men talked of a land dispute with a neighboring village, but that seemed too simple. Others whispered about a madman, a recluse, but no one had ever seen such a man. The only thing they could agree on was that they had to protect themselves. A nightly watch was set up, and men began to carry sticks and old farm tools with them everywhere they went. The close-knit community began to fray at the edges, suspicion creeping in like the marsh mist. Every shadow looked like a lurking threat, every strange sound in the night was a potential attacker. We were all on edge, and my father's grim expression told me that this was only the beginning. The marsh had taken 2 of ours, and it seemed to be sending a message. A message that our way of life, our isolated peace, was about to be shattered in a way we could never have imagined. The third disappearance was different. It wasn't a farmer, but a young girl, no older than myself. Her name was Kitrin, and she was the daughter of the local blacksmith, a big, quiet man named Gwilym. Kitrin had been playing near the edge of the marsh, chasing after a stray lamb that had wandered off from the flock. The lamb came back, frightened and bleeding, but Kitrin did not. The village's fear, once a creeping cold, now flared into a raw, angry fire. A man, or men, taking our people was one thing. A man taking a child was another. That night, Gwilym's grief echoed through the valley, a sound that was less a cry and more a raw, bellowing anguish that made my blood run cold. This time, the search was not just a grim duty. It was a vengeful hunt. The men of the village armed themselves properly, with rusted old shotguns, sturdy axes, and long, iron-tipped staves. They were no longer searching for a lost person, they were hunting a monster. Father, a practical man who knew the marsh's dangers better than anyone, tried to organize them, to make them move in a disciplined line, but the grief and rage had made them reckless. They charged into the marsh without thought, their lanterns bobbing wildly, their shouts of Kitrin, quickly turning into curses and threats. It was a mob, not a search party, and they were walking right into a trap they didn't even know was set. I watched from the safety of our cottage door, a tiny knot of fear in my stomach. The air was thick with the scent of burning peat and unspent rage. My mother held me close, her face pale, her lips moving in silent prayer. But I couldn't look away. I watched the flickering lights disappear into the dark, silent maw of the black mire, and a cold dread settled over me. This was wrong. This wasn't how you faced the marsh. You were supposed to respect it, to move with caution, to listen to its subtle warnings. But the men had thrown caution to the wind, blinded by a fury that would surely be their undoing. They returned hours later, but not all of them. The blacksmith Gwilym, the man whose daughter they were avenging, came back with a ghastly wound on his head, a gash that looked like it had been made by an axe. He was delirious, muttering about shadowy figures and an ambush. But the most chilling detail was that the men they were fighting weren't wild beasts or mad recluses. They were men, but they were dressed in the uniforms of soldiers. Not the red coats of the British Army, but something older, something different. Their clothes were dark, their faces obscured by the shadows and the swirling mist, and they moved with a silent, terrifying efficiency that the villagers, accustomed to the slow rhythm of farming life, could not hope to match. The men who returned were a shattered lot. 2 were missing, swallowed by the marsh in the chaos of the ambush. Gwilym, the blacksmith, died an hour after returning, his last words a garbled warning that we didn't understand. The remaining men were shaken to their core, not just by the violence they had faced, but by the sheer, cold-blooded efficiency of their attackers. These weren't thieves or bandits. They were organized, they were armed, and they were living deep within the marsh, using its treacherous terrain as their weapon. The fear that had settled over the village now became a panicked certainty. We weren't just dealing with a few men, we were dealing with an entire company of them. Father, a man who had seen many hard things in his life, was now faced with an impossible situation. The village was defenseless, its men broken and frightened. We were a tiny, isolated community, cut off from the rest of the world. To go to the authorities would mean days of travel through dangerous country, and we had no reason to believe they would even listen to the wild tales of a group of poor Welsh farmers. We were alone. The marsh had always felt like a natural barrier, a thing to be respected. Now, it had become a cage, with a deadly, unseen force waiting within its heart. The whispers of the silent folk were no longer just stories. They had become a terrifying reality, a reality that wore uniforms and carried cold steel, and that had just made it clear that they would not tolerate any intrusion into their desolate kingdom. We were trapped. And the sun was setting. A cold, heavy silence fell over the village. It wasn't the natural silence of a place far from the world, but the strained, fearful hush of people waiting for a blow to fall. Father, seeing the fear in the men's eyes, knew we couldn't just sit there and wait for the silent folk to come for us. He was a practical man, but he understood the stories now. The silent folk weren't ghosts, they were men who moved like ghosts, using the marsh as their weapon. He gathered the few remaining able-bodied men, their faces gaunt with shock and exhaustion, and spoke to them not as a leader, but as a father trying to protect his family. "We have to send for help," he said, his voice low but firm. "The nearest town with a constable is Aberystwyth. It's a day's ride, maybe more, and that's only if you take the main road. The marsh is a cage now. We are a rabbit in a snare. But no one wanted to go. The road out of Landvihangel skirted the very edge of the marsh, and the men who had just seen their friends ambushed in its depths were terrified. The fear was a living thing, a cold hand on their necks. They argued, some saying we should all flee into the hills, others that we should stay and barricade ourselves in the chapel. My father saw the fracture, the way the fear was pulling our community apart. He knew he had to be the one to act. He chose me. Not to go, of course, but to be his eyes and ears. He sat me down by the fire, his hands, calloused from years of farming, resting on my shoulders. "Thomas," he said, looking me straight in the eye, "I'm going to the town. I'll take the fastest horse and I'll ride until I drop. But I need you to watch the marsh, the roads, the paths. You have to be my eyes, my little shadow. If they move on the village while I'm gone, you have to get your mother and the others to safety. You have to be brave for her." It was a terrifying responsibility for a boy of 10. My heart beat so fast I thought it would burst, but I nodded. I didn't feel brave, not really. I felt a profound sense of loneliness, of being a small boy tasked with a man's burden. As the sun began to rise, Father kissed my mother's forehead, gave me a long, searching look, and rode off on our best horse, his figure disappearing into the thin morning mist. My mother and I stood on the porch, watching him go, and the silence that followed his departure was louder than any shout. The weight of the world, or at least our small corner of it, now rested on my shoulders. I spent the next day and a half on high alert. I climbed the ancient, gnarled oak tree at the edge of the village, the one that gave a clear view of the winding paths that led into the marsh. From my perch in the rustling leaves, I watched for any movement. My stomach was a tight knot, my heart pounding at the slightest sound of bird's call, the rustle of a rabbit in the undergrowth. I saw nothing. The marsh remained silent, its surface a vast, unmoving sea of green and brown. It was the same eerie calm that had preceded the disappearances. The silence was a trap, I knew it. They were waiting. They were watching. On the second evening, just as the sun was dipping below the horizon, I saw it. It wasn't a man or a movement, but a flicker of light, deep within the marsh. It was a strange, unnatural glow, not like a lantern, but a phosphorescent, ghostly blue that pulsed and then disappeared. I blinked, rubbing my eyes, thinking it was a trick of the fading light. But then it came back, brighter this time, a beacon in the twilight. I knew I had to go closer, to see what it was. I had promised my father I would be his eyes, and my curiosity, mingled with a new sense of purpose, overcame my fear. I crept from my perch in the oak tree, my feet moving silently through the grass, my small body a shadow in the falling darkness. I had to know what was out there. I had to know what was hiding in the black mire. My father was risking everything to save us, and I couldn't just sit and wait. I had to understand the enemy. I had to understand the silent folk. I crept closer to the marsh, the air growing colder with every step, the sound of my own breathing the only thing I could hear. The blue light pulsed again, beckoning, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that I was no longer an observer. I was about to become a participant. The closer I got, the more the silence of the marsh pressed in on me. The ground beneath my feet grew soft and spongy, and the air smelled of decay and wet moss. The blue light, pulsing like a ghost's heartbeat, was now a constant, strange glow in the deep gloom. I pushed through a wall of reeds taller than my head, and then I saw it. It wasn't a single light, but dozens of them. They weren't floating in the air as I had first thought. They were coming from the ground itself, from the cracks and seams of a strange, dark structure that was half buried in the mire. It was the remains of an old quarry, I realized, one that the villagers had stopped using years ago because of the treacherous bogs. A cluster of stone buildings, mostly collapsed, stood half submerged in the mire, their broken windows like hollow eyes. But it wasn't the buildings that caught my attention. It was the men. They were everywhere, shadowy figures moving with a quiet purpose, carrying what looked like heavy sacks. Their dark, tattered uniforms were the same as the ones Gwilym had described. They weren't soldiers from our time, they looked like relics from a forgotten war, a company of ghosts in a desolate place. I crouched behind a pile of wet stones, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure they would hear it. They were working, but not on the quarry. They were working on something far more sinister. I saw them pull a heavy, canvas-wrapped bundle from the marsh, a bundle the size of a man. They laid it on the ground and began to unwrap it, their movements practiced and efficient. I couldn't see what was inside, but a chill ran down my spine. This was no ordinary hiding place, this was a burial ground. Then I saw the glow again, a flicker of light as one of the men knelt beside the bundle. He was using a strange, glowing object. I couldn't make out the details, but it pulsed with the same eerie blue light I had seen from the village. He placed it inside the bundle, then the men carefully rewrapped it and began to carry it deeper into the marsh, to a place where the ground was nothing but dark, shifting water. I knew, with a certainty that was both horrifying and absolute, that they were hiding something. They were hiding bodies. My mind reeled. These weren't just men who had gotten lost. Bryn, Elwyn, and the others hadn't been victims of the marsh. They had been victims of these men. The silent folk weren't spirits, they were a community of their own, hiding in the mire, living off the land, and fiercely protecting their secret. But what was the secret? The glowing stones, the old-fashioned uniforms, the grim ritual of burial. It was more than a simple ambush or a land dispute. Suddenly, a voice, a gruff, low bark, cut through the night. One of the men had spotted me. I had moved a loose stone, and the small clatter had echoed in the unnatural silence. Panic seized me. My legs, frozen with terror, now worked on their own, and I scrambled to my feet and ran. I didn't look back. I ran blindly, stumbling through the reeds, the sound of men's shouts and the squelching of their boots in the mud behind me. They were fast, silent hunters in a place that was their home and my prison. I was a lost boy in a place of terrible secrets, and they were the keepers of those secrets. The chase was on, and I knew, with a horrifying clarity, that I was now a part of the grim history the marsh was so carefully hiding. I scrambled through the treacherous mire, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The shouts of the men behind me were a terrifying drum beat, getting closer with every stumble. I didn't know the paths they knew, the firm ground hidden beneath a deceptive layer of moss and water. I was running blind, my fear a compass pointing in no particular direction. My boots were heavy with mud, and my mind screamed at me to stop, to give up, but the image of the men and their grim cargo was a horrifying spur. I couldn't let them catch me. Just as I was about to collapse, my foot caught on something hard and unforgiving beneath the surface. I fell, my face plunging into the cold, black water of the bog. My lungs burned, and for a terrifying moment, I thought I was going to drown right there, my short life ending in a muddy, silent grave. But my hand, scrabbling for a hold, found a solid, moss-covered branch. I pulled myself up, coughing and spitting out the foul water, and realized I had fallen into an old, forgotten ditch that ran along the edge of the abandoned quarry. The men's shouts grew louder, their heavy boots thudding closer. They were right on top of me. I held my breath, pressing myself against the muddy wall of the ditch, a small, terrified animal in its burrow. The men stopped right above me, their lanterns casting an eerie, flickering light on the reeds. "Lost him," a gruff voice grumbled, his accent thick and unfamiliar. "He's just a child. He can't have gone far." They began to spread out, their voices moving away from me. I knew this was my chance. I crawled on my hands and knees, following the ditch as it snaked away from the quarry, a hidden path that they, in their frantic search, had overlooked. I moved silently, a ghost in the ghost-filled marsh, until the sounds of their search had faded into the distant cries of the night birds. Only then did I dare to stand up, my entire body shaking with cold and shock. I was free, but I was also lost. I had no idea which way was home, and the marsh had never felt more vast or more menacing. I walked for what felt like hours, a boy alone in a wilderness that was no longer just wild but actively hostile. The moon, a sliver of white in the black sky, offered no warmth. I stumbled through the darkness, my mind replaying the horrifying scene at the quarry, the dark uniformed men, the eerie blue light, the canvas-wrapped bundles. It was an image that would be burned into my memory forever. But then, through the mist, I saw it, a small, faint light in the distance. It wasn't the ghostly blue glow of the quarry. This was a warm, yellow light, the kind that promised a hearth and a warm bed. I stumbled toward it, my hopes soaring, only to realize with a sinking heart that it wasn't the lights of our village. It was a single, solitary cottage, one I had never seen before. It was old and half buried in the ground, its roof sagging, and a thin wisp of smoke curling from its crooked chimney. A woman sat by the window, her face a pale oval in the lamplight, her hands moving with quiet, deliberate motions. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking out at the marsh, her eyes wide and full of a terrible sorrow. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that she was one of them. She was a silent folk, a woman living in the heart of the monster's lair, and I was standing on her doorstep. I should have been terrified, but the woman's sorrowful face held me captive. It wasn't the face of a monster, but of a person burdened by a grief as heavy as the marsh itself. I stood frozen, a small, shivering figure in the gloom, until her eyes, pale as the morning mist, finally found mine. She didn't shout. She didn't call for the others. She simply rose, and with a gesture as old and weary as the stones of her cottage, she beckoned me inside. I hesitated for only a moment. The men in the marsh were a known evil, the unknown of this cottage felt like a lesser, more fragile danger. I pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped into a world that felt both familiar and utterly alien. The air was warm with the scent of wood smoke and herbs. A small fire crackled in the hearth, and a single lantern cast long shadows across a room filled with simple, handmade furniture and shelves lined with glass bottles of strange-smelling liquids. The woman, whose name I would later learn was Illyra, was not what I expected. She was old, her hair a tangle of silver, her hands gnarled with age and work, but her eyes held a spark of life, a deep, ancient wisdom. She sat me down by the fire, handing me a bowl of warm broth that I drank greedily, the first warm thing I had had in what felt like a lifetime. She spoke to me in a soft, melodic Welsh, a dialect so old it sounded like a song. She told me of her people, the silent folk. They weren't soldiers, not in the way our village understood. They were a community, the descendants of Welsh miners and rebels who had fled into the marsh generations ago to escape the brutality of the English gentry and the encroaching industrial age. They had built their own world here, a hidden society thriving on the marsh's harsh bounty. The quarry, she explained, was not just a hiding place, it was their home, a place of safety and work, and the strange blue light was not magic, but a natural, phosphorescent mineral they had found deep within the earth, their only source of light and a closely guarded secret. "We have lived here in peace for 100 years, she said, her voice a whisper. "We have taken nothing from your people, and your people have left us alone. But things change. A new generation of men, they see the marsh not just as a refuge, but as a kingdom to be defended at all costs. And they see your people as a threat." Her words explained everything and nothing at all. I asked her about Bryn and Elwyn, about the disappearances. Her face, a mask of sorrow, told me the truth before she spoke it. "Your people started to stray too close," she said. "They started to find our paths, to find our homes. The young men, they feared our secret would be exposed. They acted, rashly. They believed that a few disappearances would be enough to keep you away, to make your people fear the marsh again, just as they always had." But it was when she spoke of Katrin, the blacksmith's daughter, that her voice broke. The girl, that was not their intention. It was a mistake, a terrible, tragic mistake. The lamb, it wandered into a place where our people were working. They were frightened, and in the chaos, she fell. They didn't take her, the marsh did. They simply found her and hid her, to keep your people from finding our secret. Illyra explained that the ambush on the search party was a desperate attempt to drive the villagers back, to re-establish the fear that had kept them safe for so long. They had killed to protect their way of life, and in doing so, they had sealed their own fate. I asked her why she was telling me all this, a boy from the very village they were at war with. She smiled a sad, knowing smile. "Because you are not like them, Thomas. You do not hate. You are just a boy who is lost, and I am a woman who has seen too much." She told me that the men of her community had gone too far, and that there was no going back now. They had broken the silent peace, and the consequences would be terrible. She gave me a map, a crude, hand-drawn thing that showed the hidden paths of the marsh, the safe places and the deadly ones. "You must take this," she said, her eyes pleading. "You must find your father. You must tell your people. The battle is coming, and they will need to know the truth if they are to survive." With a final, sorrowful look, she led me to a hidden path that would take me back to my village, a silent, heartbroken woman in a cottage that was a testament to a long-forgotten history, now on the brink of being lost forever. I emerged from the marsh a different boy. The child who had been fascinated by ghost stories was gone, replaced by a terrified witness who had seen the true face of the silent folk. My clothes were torn and mud-stained, my face was pale, and in my trembling hand, I clutched the crude map that was both my salvation and a terrible burden. I ran the rest of the way, bursting into the village square just as the first glimmer of dawn touched the hills. My mother, who had spent the night in a state of silent, tearful prayer, rushed to me, pulling me into a hug so tight I could barely breathe. But I pushed her away, my eyes frantically searching the faces of the men who had gathered. My father wasn't there. He hadn't returned. My heart sank, a cold, heavy stone in my chest. He had left to save us, and in doing so, he had walked into the very danger he had feared. I knew with a dreadful certainty that the silent folk had found him. I held up the map, my voice cracking as I told them everything, the hidden quarry, the uniforms, the glowing stones, and the terrible, heartbreaking truth about Bryn, Elwyn, and Kitrin. I told them about Illyra, a woman of deep sorrow who had shown me the humanity behind the monsters. The men listened, their faces a mixture of disbelief, fear, and growing rage. They didn't know what to believe, but the map was real, a tangible piece of proof that their enemies were not ghosts, but flesh and blood, and they were hiding in plain sight. The village was a tinderbox, and my words were the spark. Some wanted to ride for help, but the fear of losing more men on the long journey was too great. The majority, fueled by grief and a thirst for vengeance, wanted to march back into the marsh, to burn the quarry and kill every single one of the silent folk. I tried to tell them what Illyra had said, that the battle was coming, and that they would need to be smart, to use the map, to use caution. But they weren't listening. The men were no longer just farmers, they were an avenging army, and they were blinded by a hatred that burned hotter than any peat fire. The massacre that followed was not a battle, it was an act of brutal, desperate violence that would forever stain the history of our small village. The men, guided by my map, found the hidden quarry and ambushed the silent folk, a surprise attack that should have been a victory. But the silent folk, living in their hidden fortress for generations, were not easily defeated. They fought with a ferocity born of desperation, a people fighting to protect their last refuge in the world. It was a bloody, chaotic mess, a fight in the dark with no rules and no quarter given. Both sides suffered terribly. The silent folk, outmanned and outgunned, were all but wiped out. The few who survived fled deeper into the marsh, to a place where no one would ever find them. The villagers, though victorious, were forever changed. They returned with the grim task of burying their own, and the bodies of those they had killed. They found my father's body near the quarry, his face peaceful in death, and knew that he had died trying to warn them, trying to stop the fight before it had even begun. They also found the bodies of Bryn, Elwyn, and the others, and the glowing stones, the secret that had cost so many lives. It was all a painful, horrifying reality. They had won, but the cost had been too high. The village was broken, its people consumed by a grief and a guilt that would never leave them. In the end, the villagers made a pact. The massacre was to be forgotten. The quarry was to be filled in and the secret of the silent folk and their glowing stones was to be buried, a history that would never be written. They did not want the outside world to know what they had done, and they did not want their children to grow up knowing the terrible darkness that had claimed their fathers. They wanted to forget, to erase, to bury the Marshland Massacre forever. And so they did. History, which is always written by the winners, never recorded what happened in the deep, silent mire of Llanfihangel Wycroydon. The story of the silent folk became a myth, a bedtime story told in hushed tones, a secret passed down from one generation to the next, a secret that I, a boy who had seen it all, would carry with me to my grave. The marsh kept its secrets, and so did we.